Ist überhaupt hier?
Ich verbrech das so, dass ich in dem Wald drin bin. Ich trag dir die Rotznase noch so lang, bis es leer wird. Die saublöde Weib. Für uns gibt's kein Todes. Nee, in alle Ewigkeit.
Anneliese Michel was born in 19...
By the time she died, she weighed 66 pounds, and the priests still believed the demons hadn't left. She hadn't eaten a real meal in months. Her knees had been shattered, broken, literally broken, from kneeling on stone floors for hours of prayer. Her lips were cracked. Her voice had been reduced to something that didn't sound human anymore. And everyone around her believed she was getting better. This is not a story about religion versus science. This is a story about a young woman who was failed by every single person who was supposed to protect her, and the recordings she left behind that still, to this day, have no good explanation. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to have to decide for yourself what you believe. Picture a town so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. Klingenberg am Main, Bavaria, Germany, 1952. Tucked into the hills of southern Germany, Klingenberg looks like something lifted from a fairy tale. Narrow, cobblestone streets, whitewashed houses with dark timber frames, a Catholic church at the center of everything like a compass needle pointing toward God. The forests around the town are dense and old. In winter, the fog rolls down from the hills and sits in the streets like it owns the place. This was the world Anneliese Michel was born into. Her parents, Joseph and Anna Michel, were devout Catholics. Not casually religious, deeply, fundamentally religious, in the way that some families are in small European towns, where the church has been the center of community life for hundreds of years. Joseph had been connected to a third-order Franciscan group. Anna wore her faith like a second skin. They had 4 daughters. Anneliese was the third. From the outside, the Michel home looked like exactly what it was: a hard-working, God-fearing, respectable German family. The girls went to church. They prayed before meals. They were raised with the understanding that the spiritual world was just as real as the physical one. That understanding would later become everything. When Anneliese was a child, there were whispers about her family, the kind of whispers that follow families in small Catholic communities. Anna had given birth to a daughter before she married Joseph, a daughter outside of wedlock. In the deeply religious culture of post-war Bavaria, that was considered a serious transgression, a sin that needed to be atoned for. Anna took that guilt seriously. And Anneliese, watching her mother, absorbed that too. The idea that suffering was connected to penance, that the body and pain and God were all tangled up together. Nobody knew then what a dangerous foundation that would become. Anneliese grew up quietly. She was described by people who knew her as warm, joyful, deeply kind. She wanted to become a teacher. She had friends. She laughed easily. There was nothing about her early childhood that would suggest what was coming, until the night when she was 16 years old, and something went wrong. It was 1968. Anneliese was in her bed when her body suddenly went rigid. She couldn't speak. She couldn't call out. Her muscles locked and she lay there, paralyzed, staring at the ceiling while something moved through her body like a current of electricity that had no switch. When it passed, she was confused and exhausted. She didn't tell her parents right away. She wasn't sure what had happened. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was nothing. But it happened again and again. By the time her family brought her to a doctor, the episodes were happening regularly. She was diagnosed with grand mal epilepsy, a serious neurological condition that causes severe, full-body seizures. The doctors prescribed anticonvulsant medication and told the family this was manageable. This was treatable. Medicine had an answer. But Anneliese wasn't getting better. And something else was happening. Something the medication didn't touch. She began to feel a presence. Not the warm presence she'd been taught to associate with prayer and church. This was different. Cold, heavy, like standing in a room where someone had just left. Except the someone had never been alive. She told no one at first. She was a devout girl from a devout family, and she understood, or thought she understood, what it meant to experience spiritual darkness. She increased her prayers. She went to confession. She attended Mass more frequently, hoping to push the feeling away. Instead, it grew. Then came 1969. She was at a religious boarding school, a pilgrimage institute in Middelburg, where she was studying. She was sitting in chapel when she looked down and saw the floor moving beneath her feet. Not just a visual hallucination, she described it as seeing a demonic face looking up at her from the stone. She smelled something. Something burning and foul. Something that didn't belong in a place of worship. She ran. A nun found her outside, trembling, unable to explain what she'd seen. Anneliese was 19 years old, away from home for the first time, and she was terrified in a way she couldn't articulate to anyone around her. Because the fear wasn't physical. It was soul deep. She began having episodes of automatic behavior during her seizures. She would speak in voices that weren't hers. She would growl. She would say things in languages she didn't speak fluently. During one episode, she apparently cursed, violently, with a rage that seemed to come from somewhere outside her. And then wept afterward because she didn't understand where those words had come from. Her mother would later say she saw something in Anneliese's eyes during those moments. Something that didn't look like her daughter. Now, let's pause here for a second, because this is where the story splits into two completely different narratives. And I'm going to hold both of them up for you throughout this video, because that's the only honest way to tell it. On one side, Anneliese had epilepsy, and almost certainly also had severe depression and likely schizophrenia or another serious psychiatric condition. The voices, the visions, the behavioral changes. These are all documented symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy combined with serious mental illness. Treatable. Understood by modern medicine. On the other side, the recordings. Because eventually, recordings were made. Cassette tapes of the exorcism sessions. And those recordings, I'll get to them in detail, are genuinely difficult to explain away. I'm not going to tell you which side to believe. That's not my job. My job is to tell you what happened. And what happened was dark enough on its own. Before we see what happens next, make sure you subscribe. You won't want to miss the moment the demon spoke. By 1970, Anneliese was at the University of Würzburg, studying to become a teacher. On the surface, this was a success story. But the episodes hadn't stopped. But the episodes hadn't stopped. If anything, they were evolving. The seizures continued despite medication. But now there were other things happening between the seizures. Long stretches of deep depression where Anneliese would barely leave her room. She stopped eating properly. She started hearing voices that spoke to her continuously, not just during episodes. Voices that she believed were telling her she was damned, that she was going to hell, that there was no salvation for her. Think about what that would do to someone raised the way she was raised. For a secular person, hearing a voice say, "You're going to hell," might be terrifying but abstract. For Anneliese Michel, raised in a world where heaven and hell were as real as the kitchen table, that was the worst possible thing anyone could say. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a sentence. She carried this alone for longer than she should have. When she finally confided in someone at university, a fellow student who was also deeply religious, the conversation didn't go toward doctors. It went toward prayer, toward the possibility that what Anneliese was experiencing wasn't neurological, that it was spiritual warfare. This was the early 1970s, and while it might be easy now to look back and say, obviously she needed psychiatric help, it's worth remembering the world she was living in. Rural Catholic Bavaria, a family that viewed spiritual explanations not as superstition, but as documented reality. A tradition, the Catholic Church has a centuries-old rite of exorcism that takes demonic possession seriously as a theological possibility. She began praying even more intensely. She visited shrines. She asked for intercessory prayer from people she trusted. And then one evening in 1973, something happened that she would describe for the floor, the way she'd been taught to pray, floor, the way she'd been taught to pray, the way her mother prayed. And the crucifix on her wall, she said, turned into something else. She described a face appearing in it, not Christ's face. A face with no light in it. A face that smiled at her in a way that made her feel like her soul was being looked at and found worthless. She screamed. Her roommate came running, found Anneliese on the floor, convulsing, clawing at her own arms. That was September 1973, and that was the last time Anneliese Michel had what most people would call a normal day. Here is something the history books don't always mention, because it's the kind of detail that resists easy categorization. Multiple people around Anneliese, family members, students, eventually priests, reported smelling something when she had her most severe episodes. Not the typical smells associated with seizures, not the metallic or organic smell that some epileptics experience. Something sulfuric, something like rot and heat combined. A priest who would later become involved in the exorcisms said the first time he walked into a room where Anneliese had just had an episode, before he even knew what had been happening, he stopped in the doorway because of the smell. He described it as the smell of something that should not exist in a room full of living people. Dismiss it if you want. There are neurological explanations for olfactory hallucinations. Doctors who've reviewed the case cite several. But the smell was reported independently, by multiple witnesses, including people who had no theological investment in the outcome. I'm just telling you what was reported. Back to Anneliese. By late 1973, she had begun doing things during her worst episodes that frightened even her family. She would eat insects, spiders, flies, apparently without awareness. She would lick the floor. She would tear at her clothing, scratch her skin until it bled, and then stop, suddenly, completely, and look around the room as if she had just woken up somewhere unfamiliar. She was ashamed afterward, deeply, devastatingly ashamed. She would cry and pray and beg for it to stop. Her parents had been taking her to doctors for 5 years at this point. Neurologists, psychiatrists, various specialists. The diagnosis remained epilepsy, with the newer suggestion of mental illness layered on top. Medication was adjusted, therapy was attempted, nothing helped. Anneliese, in conversations with family and friends during this period, began expressing a belief that the medication wasn't helping because the problem wasn't medical. She said, and this is documented, that she had begun to feel multiple presences. Not one, several, like different voices with different personalities. She named them eventually. Cain, Nero, Judas, Iscariot, Hitler, and two demons she called Fleischmann and Lucifer. Now, to be clear, labeling one's inner voices with historical or religious names is something that occurs in certain psychiatric conditions. It is a known phenomenon. Clinicians reading this case from a purely medical perspective see this as evidence of a dissociative or psychotic process. But here is where it becomes complicated. Because when priests eventually performed the rite of exorcism, when they asked these entities questions, the answers they received weren't always consistent with what Anneliese herself could have known. Historical details, theological details, spoken in voices that witnesses said did not sound like a young German woman. The recordings exist. Researchers have analyzed them, and the debate about what is on those tapes has never fully closed. We'll get there. For now, 1973 was ending, and Anneliese's family was running out of medical options and running toward the church. This is the part of the story that most people don't know. The church said no. At first, Anneliese's family had been in contact with priests since her symptoms intensified. A local priest named Ernst Alt had been visiting Anneliese and observing her condition since early 1973. He genuinely believed something beyond medical explanation was occurring. He wanted to pursue an exorcism. But to perform the rite of exorcism in the Catholic Church, you need permission from a bishop. It's not something a priest can simply decide to do. There are protocols, investigations. The Church, whatever else you might think of it, takes a cautious position on possessions by default. The official teaching is that apparent possessions should be presumed to have natural explanations unless there is overwhelming evidence otherwise. Father Alt's requests were denied multiple times. The bishop's office reviewed the case and concluded that there was insufficient evidence to proceed with an official exorcism. They recommended continued medical treatment. Anneliese's family continued medical treatment, continued praying, continued watching her deteriorate. By 1974, Anneliese had begun refusing to eat, not as a symptom, as a choice, a form of penance. She had become convinced that her suffering was spiritually meaningful, that she was somehow bearing suffering on behalf of others. This idea of redemptive suffering is a real concept in Catholic theology. Saints throughout church history have practiced extreme physical mortification. For Anneliese, it became merged with her illness in a way that was catastrophic. She was getting thinner. She was getting weaker. And the voices never stopped. Father Alt, watching this, doubled his efforts to get permission. He brought in another priest, Father Arnold Renz, a man with experience in the rite of exorcism, who had studied it extensively. Together, they made the case to the Diocese of Würzburg. The bishop finally gave permission in September 1975. It had taken 2 years of requests, 2 years during which Anneliese continued to decline. By the time the exorcisms began, she was 23 years old. She had been sick in some form since she was 16. 7 years of seizures, voices, deterioration, medical appointments that hadn't solved anything, and religious requests that kept being denied. She was exhausted. But when she learned that the church had agreed to perform the exorcism, the people around her said she seemed, briefly, relieved. Like someone who had been treading water for a long time and had finally been thrown something to hold on to. That detail cuts me every time I read this case. She was relieved. September 24th, 1975. The Michel home in Klingenberg, an autumn evening. The town quiet outside. Father Rentz and Father Alt arrived at the house with everything needed for the rite of exorcism. Holy water, a crucifix, the Roman ritual. A formal, waited. And Father Renz later described waited. And Father Renz later described walking through that door and feeling, not seeing, not hearing, but physically feeling, something that made him want to step back. A pressure, a wrongness in the air. He pushed through it and began. The ritual was conducted in Latin. The priest commanded any unclean spirits to identify themselves and depart. He called on the authority of Christ. He prayed. He held the crucifix near Anneliese. And Anneliese began to transform. People who witnessed the early sessions described it as watching someone else use Anneliese's body. Her face would change. Her voice would change. She would speak in tones that didn't seem physically possible for her. Deep, guttural sounds that filled the room. She would speak in different voices, one after another, sometimes overlapping. She would scream. And then she would be Anneliese again, exhausted, often weeping, asking if it was getting better, asking if they were leaving. Father Renz began recording the sessions. Those recordings, let's talk about them properly now. Approximately 41 hours of audio exist from the exorcism sessions. They have been analyzed by linguists, psychologists, and various researchers over the decades since Anneliese's death. The recordings were also used as evidence in the criminal trial that followed. What's on them is genuinely disturbing. Voices that shift between recognizably Anneliese and something else. Something lower. Something with different cadences and speech patterns. Multiple voices that appear to argue with each other. Voices that claim to be historical figures and, in some instances, provide details that researchers have found difficult to explain as things Anneliese would simply have known. There's one recording in which a voice, claiming to be Judas, describes specific emotional states around betrayal using theological language that goes beyond what you'd expect from a young German education major. There's another in which a voice apparently responds to a question that, according to the witnesses, Father Renz had not yet spoken aloud. Now, I am not telling you this as evidence of possession. I am telling you this as documentation of something that remains genuinely unexplained. Psychologists suggest that people experiencing certain dissociative states can produce remarkable performances that feel like separate identities. The human brain, in extremis, does things we don't fully understand. What I can tell you is that the recordings affected everyone who heard them, including the investigators who would later listen to them in court. Back in the Michel house, autumn turned to winter. The sessions continued, every week, sometimes more frequently. The priests praying, Anneliese responding, the voices arguing with the Latin, the screaming, the silence after. And each session, when the voices retreated and Anneliese came back to herself, she would ask the same question. Are they going? Are they leaving? And the priests would say, we're fighting. We're still fighting. By early 1976, Anneliese Michel weighed less than 100 pounds. She had been refusing food consistently, sometimes under the influence of what she described as commands from the voices, sometimes because she genuinely believed her starvation was meaningful, was part of some spiritual struggle she was bearing for others. Her knees were destroyed. During the exorcism sessions, she would genuflect, kneel deeply, repeatedly, sometimes hundreds of times in a single session. Her family counted 600 genuflections in one night. The cartilage in her knees wore away. The bones fractured. She couldn't walk without help. She had torn muscle tissue in her legs from the convulsions. She had bruises across her body that the priests and her family attributed to her throwing herself against walls and furniture during sessions. She had stopped brushing her teeth. She had stopped bathing without assistance. She was present in the world, in a body that was systematically being destroyed, either by her own choices, her illness, or, depending on what you believe, something else entirely. And she kept asking for the exorcisms to continue. This is important, because this is the question that the trial and the public debate and every serious examination of this case keeps coming back to. Anneliese was an adult. She was 23, then 24 years old. She was not incapacitated in every moment. There were periods of clarity, of normal conversation, of expressed preferences. And her expressed preference, consistently, repeatedly, was that the exorcisms continue. She told Father Renz that she felt them working, that she felt the presences getting weaker, that she believed she was close to the end of it. Was that belief the symptom of her illness? Was it the desperate hope of a suffering person grasping for meaning? Or was it, as she and the priests believed, spiritual discernment? I can't answer that for you. But what I can tell you is that while Anneliese believed she was getting better, her body was shutting down. Father Alt visited the house in the spring of 1976 and later described what he saw. Anneliese lying in her room, the curtains drawn because light hurt her. The smell, that smell again, present in the room despite the windows being opened. Anneliese herself speaking lucidly, asking about her university studies, expressing hope that she would get back to them. She told him she wanted to become a teacher. She still wanted that. She told him she was tired. So tired. But that she knew this was almost over. She told him she wasn't afraid. Father Alt left the house that day and got into his car and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, without starting the engine. He knew something she didn't know. He knew she didn't have much longer. June 30, 1976. The final exorcism session. Anneliese was barely able to sit up. She weighed 68 pounds. She hadn't consumed solid food in days. Her body temperature was slightly elevated, not dramatically, but enough that a doctor would have recognized it as a sign of systemic collapse. The session was conducted anyway. Father Renz performed the prayers. Father Alt was present. Her parents were in the house. The recordings from that final session are the most disturbing of all. The voices were different that night, less combative, more final, like something wrapping up rather than fighting. Some researchers who have analyzed the tapes describe the final session as sounding like an ending, like the recorded voices knew it was over. Anneliese, in her own voice, spoke during breaks in the session. She said, and this is documented, this is on the tape, as she said, I am afraid. She had said she wasn't afraid just weeks before. She asked her mother to stay close. She said she was tired. The session ended sometime in the early morning hours of July 1st. Anneliese was helped to her bed. Her mother sat with her. She fell asleep. On July 1st, 1976, at approximately 6 a.m., Anneliese Michel died. She was 23 years old. The immediate cause of death was determined to be dehydration and malnutrition. Her body had simply stopped being able to sustain itself. There was also evidence of pneumonia, which in her weakened state would have been devastating. She had weighed 68 pounds. Her room, by the accounts of the people who were there when she was found, was quiet. No presence, no voices, no smell. Just a young woman who had stopped breathing. And outside the window, Klingenberg was waking up. Birds. Someone walking a dog on the cobblestones below. a completely ordinary summer morning. The German state did not treat this as a private tragedy. They treated it as a crime. In 1978, Joseph and Anneliese Michel and fathers Renz and Alt stood trial for negligent homicide. The prosecution's argument was straightforward. Anneliese Michel had died of causes that were entirely preventable. She needed medical care. She received exorcisms instead. The people responsible for her, her parents and her priests, had watched her deteriorate and done nothing to save her physical body. The trial lasted several months. The recordings were played in court. Witnesses testified to what they had seen and heard during the sessions. Medical experts testified about the causes and progression of her death. Psychiatric experts testified about the nature of her illness. The defendants testified about what they believed, what they had seen, why they had made the choices they made. Father Renz, under cross-examination, described the moment in one of the early sessions when he became convinced, personally, completely, that what he was witnessing was not a psychiatric condition. He described a moment when the entity speaking through Anneliese said something that he, and only he, could have known from a completely private conversation years earlier. The prosecutor pointed out that Anneliese could have learned this information through other means. Father Renz acknowledged that was possible. He said it didn't change what he believed. The judge and jury ultimately found all 4 defendants guilty. Joseph and Anneliese Michel and Father Alt were found guilty of negligent homicide. They were sentenced to 6 months in prison. Suspended sentences, meaning none of them actually served prison time. They received 3 years of probation. Father Renz received the same sentence. The judge, in delivering the verdict, made a statement that has been quoted in almost every subsequent discussion of this case. He said, paraphrasing, that the defendants were not evil people. They were people who had made choices based on a sincere belief system and had, in doing so, failed to protect the person in their care. The punishment was meant to reflect the severity of that failure, while acknowledging the complexity of what had led to it. Nobody called it justice. Not really. The prosecutor didn't think the sentences were strong enough. Anneliese's supporters, and there were many, didn't think there should have been a trial at all. And Anneliese Michel, who might have had something to say about all of it, was dead. Anneliese Michel is buried in the cemetery in Klingenberg am Main. Her grave is not hidden. It is not obscure. If you go to Klingenberg, and people do, you can walk to the cemetery and stand at the grave of a 23-year-old woman who died in 1976 and whose story still, nearly 50 years later, draws people from around the world. Some come to pray for her. Some come because they believe she was a martyr, someone who suffered spiritually on behalf of others, as she herself believed. Some come because they're drawn by the mystery of it. The same reason you're still watching this video. The recordings still exist. They are not publicly available in their entirety, but portions have been transcribed, analyzed, and discussed in academic literature, documentaries, and theological studies. Every few years, some researcher or journalist takes a fresh look and comes to a slightly different conclusion. The debate never fully closes. In 2005, a horror film called The Exorcism of Emily Rose was released. It was based, loosely, on Anneliese's story. It was not presented as a documentary, but it reintroduced her case to a new generation. In 2006, another film called Requiem, a German production, told her story much more directly, much more soberly, from the perspective of someone exploring the mental illness explanation. It was critically acclaimed. It also didn't close the debate, because nothing closes the debate. The Catholic Church has never officially recognized Anneliese Michel's case as a genuine possession. Officially, the church's position is that the case was a tragedy involving mental illness and misjudgment. Unofficially, privately, certain theologians and priests have expressed that what was documented in those recordings deserves more serious consideration than a clean psychiatric dismissal allows. Dr. Felicitas Goodman, an anthropologist and linguist who analyzed the recordings extensively, published research suggesting that the vocalizations on the tapes were consistent with possession states documented across multiple cultures and time periods. Her findings were controversial. They remain controversial. The psychiatrists who treated Anneliese before the exorcisms maintained to the end of their careers that she had a treatable condition and that the exorcisms had killed her. They weren't wrong that the exorcisms killed her. That part isn't in dispute. The dispute is about what the exorcisms were treating. I want to ask you something before we get to the final part of this story. If you had been in that house in Klingenberg in 1975, if you had heard those voices, smelled that smell, watched what the witnesses watched, what would you have done? Easy to say. Gotten her to a hospital, called a psychiatrist, pushed harder for medical intervention. But here's what makes this case genuinely haunting rather than simply tragic. She had been to hospitals. She had been to psychiatrists. She had been on medication for years. And she was still, by every account from people who loved her and had no reason to lie, getting worse. The medical establishment had not helped her. I'm not saying the exorcisms helped her either. The evidence is conclusively that they killed her. But I'm asking you to sit inside the impossible position her family was in. Watching someone you love deteriorate over years. Trying everything that science offers. Getting nowhere. And then, your faith, the foundation of your entire life, the thing that has always told you what is real. Your faith offers an explanation and a solution. What do? Joseph Michel, Anneliese's father, died in 1985. He never publicly expressed regret about the decision to pursue the exorcisms. What he expressed was grief. Profound, unending grief. Not the guilt of someone who knew they'd done wrong, the grief of someone who believed they had done everything they could and still lost her. Anna Michel lived until 2008. She reportedly visited her daughter's grave every single day until her health made it impossible. What does that grief look like? What does it mean? It doesn't tell us what happened in that room. It doesn't tell us what was on those recordings. But it tells us something about the cost, about the particular horror of making a catastrophic mistake from a place of love. I've been building to this since the beginning, and it's time to be specific. There are a few moments on those tapes that researchers, even skeptical secular researchers, have had difficulty dismissing entirely. The first is an incident Father Renz testified about. During one session, a voice identifying itself as a specific historical figure, not a famous one, not a celebrity of history, but a relatively obscure figure from church history, provided a specific date and circumstance that historians later checked and found to be accurate. Not something that would be in a general education. Something specific enough that researchers asked, how did she know that? The answer is possibly that she read it somewhere. Humans absorb information in ways they're not consciously aware of. And there is a documented psychological phenomenon called cryptomnesia, where memories surface without the person recognizing them as memories, making them seem like new information. This is the scientific explanation for how people appear to channel knowledge they shouldn't have. It's a real explanation. It's not a satisfying one for everyone. The second is the voice quality. There are recordings where Anneliese, a 23-year-old woman, small, physically weakened, produces sounds that audio engineers have described as physically challenging to explain. Not impossible, not supernatural. But the resonance, the overtones, the sustained volume, particularly in the later sessions when she was desperately malnourished, have prompted genuine questions about mechanism. Again, the human body does things under extreme psychological duress that we don't fully understand. Documented cases of people performing physical feats in states of extreme stress or dissociation. The brain is astonishing. There are explanations. But the explanations are complicated. And the third, the one that stays with me, is something far simpler than any of the above. There's a recording from a session maybe 2 months before she died. Anneliese, in her own voice, clearly her, recognizably her, no ambiguity, says something to the priests between the formal prayers. She says, "I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go home." She was in her parents' house. She wasn't talking about Klingenberg. Father Renz reportedly stopped the session and asked her what she meant. She didn't answer. A different voice came through. The session continued. Those words, "I want to go home," spoken by a 23-year-old woman 2 months before she died, in a voice that sounds exhausted in a way that goes beyond physical tiredness. Those words are on the tape. Make of them what you will. A lot of people who tell Anneliese's story frame it as a cautionary tale. Religion versus science. Medieval thinking versus modern medicine. Faith as a weapon that killed a vulnerable girl. I don't think that framing is wrong, but I don't think it's complete. Because if you reduce this story to religion, bad, medicine, good, you miss something important. You miss the fact that medicine didn't save her either. You miss the years before the exorcisms, when doctors saw her regularly and she continued to decline. You miss the genuine complexity of what she experienced and what the people around her experienced. And you miss the most disturbing possibility. Not the supernatural one, but the systemic one. Anneliese Michel fell into a gap. A gap between medical institutions that couldn't or didn't adequately treat her, and a religious institution that stepped into that gap with something that felt like an answer but was actually something else entirely. She needed someone, a doctor, a priest, a parent, a teacher, anyone, to hold both things at once, to say, "We take your spiritual suffering seriously, and we will not let your body die." To insist on both. Nobody did that. That's not a comfortable lesson. It doesn't resolve into a bumper sticker. It doesn't let anyone off the hook completely. But it's the honest one. And here is the final thing I'll say about Anneliese Michel. She wanted to be a teacher. That was her dream, not sainthood, not martyrdom, not to be a case study in demonology or a subject for documentaries half a century after her death. She wanted to stand in front of a classroom full of children and teach them something. She wanted a normal life. She wanted the voices to stop. She wanted to go home to Klingenberg and be well. She never got any of that. She got 67 exorcism sessions. She got a grave that strangers visit. She got this story, told by people who weren't there, about a mystery that will never be fully resolved. That's the real horror of this case. Not the voices, not the recordings, not the smell in the room or the shifting faces or the Latin prayers in the dark. The real horror is that she was a person, a young woman, someone's daughter, someone with dreams and a future that was taken from her, piece by piece, in a house in Bavaria, while the people who loved her did what they thought was right. And it wasn't enough. Klingenberg am Main still exists. The church is still at the center of town. The streets are still cobblestone. The forests still gather fog in winter. Anneliese's grave still gets flowers. The recordings are still in the possession of the church, still analyzed by researchers who can't quite agree on what they mean. The priests died, having never recanted their belief in what they witnessed. The doctors died, having never revised their medical conclusion. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, between the faith and the medicine, between the living and the dead, between what is documented and what remains stubbornly unexplained, there is a 23-year-old woman in a dimly lit room in 1976, asking if the voices are leaving yet, asking if it's almost over, saying she wants to go home. If this story stayed with you, and I think it did, leave me a comment below with just one word. Whatever word describes what you felt while watching this. Don't explain it. Just the word. Because this story doesn't deserve a simple reaction, and I want to see what it does to people. If you've never subscribed to this channel, now is probably the moment. We tell stories like this, the ones that don't clean up neatly, the ones that stay in your chest after the screen goes dark. If that's what you're here for, you're in the right place. And if you know someone who would watch all the way to the end of a story about a young woman in Bavaria who just wanted to go home, share this with them. The case of Anneliese Michel has been open for almost 50 years. Maybe that's exactly where it's supposed to stay.